There are days when you want to be silent, yet immediately feel guilty for that silence. Someone asks, "What's wrong?" and you quickly reply, "Nothing, I'm just a little tired." It sounds harmless, but it's a request to rest, be yourself, and not have to prove anything. You're afraid of being misunderstood, scared people will think you've changed, and afraid your quietness will make them drift away. So you start explaining why you're sad, pulled back, and don't smile as much anymore. Each explanation seems meant to make others understand, but it's meant to make you feel safe. Because deep down, you fear they'll leave if you don't clarify. You don't realize you're living inside an invisible courtroom where you're always the defendant and other people's eyes are the judges. Whenever you say, "I'm fine, I'm okay," or "I didn't mean," that you're fighting for the right to exist. I understand that feeling. I used to live that way. I used to fear silence so much that I filled it with words. Once, I tried to explain to a friend why I had become quiet, giving all sorts of reasons, work fatigue and being busy. But when I got home, I realized I had just spent the whole evening defending my right to be silent. I wasn't speaking to connect, I was talking to seek permission. And in that moment, I understood I was no longer free. Carl Jung once said, "Behind every explanation is the fear of being rejected for who we are." And Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Both meet at the same truth. When you live authentically, you no longer need to be understood, because truth needs no defense, only fear does. I still remember the first time I stopped explaining. When someone asked me why I had been so quiet lately, I said, "Because I want some peace." And then I stopped. No more words. In that moment, my heart pounded, my mind raced with reasons to add, but I stayed silent. And in those few seconds, I felt myself return. I didn't need approval. I didn't need understanding. I just needed to agree with myself. When you stop explaining, the world doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter. And in that quiet, you begin to hear your voice again, which was once buried under apologies. Not the voice of someone seeking acceptance, but of someone who has accepted themselves. That's where peace begins. If these words resonate with you, try writing a straightforward thing in the comments below, not to explain but to affirm. I choose calm over approval. Write it as a reminder that you don't need to be understood to be at peace. Because true freedom doesn't begin when others understand you, but when you stop needing them to. Yet before embracing silence, we must know why we can't. The need to be understood, sometimes it isn't a habit but an addiction. An addiction that makes us chase approval even when we know it costs us our peace. And right there, the journey begins. Chapter 1. The addiction to being understood. There is a kind of addiction that no one talks about. It doesn't destroy your health, but slowly makes you lose yourself. It is the addiction to being understood. We don't just want others to listen, we want them to understand. To understand why we're sad and quiet, to know that we mean no harm. Whenever we're misunderstood, we rush to explain, justify, and do everything we can so that others can see the good version of us. But the more we try to prove, the further we drift from what's real. I used to be that way. I used to believe that if I explained myself well enough with honesty and care, people would understand and love me more. I once sent long messages to clarify something small. I lost sleep because someone didn't reply. I once said, "I want you to understand me," but I was really asking for something else. The feeling of safety. Carl Jung once said, "Behind every explanation is the fear of being rejected for who we are." And I realized he was right. Every time we feel the need to be understood, we fear that we won't be loved if we aren't. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Do not let your mind depend on the thoughts of others." When we live to be understood, we unknowingly become slaves to the gaze around us. We measure our worth by the reactions of others instead of by the stillness within ourselves. If you pay attention, you'll notice this. The ones who explain the most are often those who've been deeply hurt. They were once judged, silenced, or left without an answer. Since then, they've feared that feeling would return, so they learned to talk, justify, ask permission, and be accepted. And along the way, they forgot that absolute acceptance never comes from others. It begins within. I once had a friend who would always say sorry, even when she did nothing wrong. One day I asked her why she always needed to explain herself. She smiled sadly and said, "Because if I don't, I'm afraid they'll think I'm cold." I saw myself in her answer. We don't fear being misunderstood. We fear being left behind because of it. And that's why we still do, even when no one asks us to explain. But one day, you get tired. You realize that no explanation is long enough to make someone truly understand you if they never wanted to in the first place. And in that moment, you learn an essential truth. Truth doesn't need defense. The first time I chose silence instead of explanation, I was afraid. I felt like I had done something wrong. But when I didn't speak, I began to listen. I heard a small voice. Do they still think well of me? And then another answered, does that really matter? And for the first time, I felt my mind become lighter. Not because someone understood me, but because I stopped trying to make them do so. The addiction to being understood can't be cured by explaining better. It can only be healed by learning to bear not being understood. When you can stand still in that space, you are free. You stop chasing approval. You stop fearing other people's eyes. You live and let your truth shine on its own. If you're hearing this, try writing one sentence in the comments, not to prove but to remind yourself. I no longer chase to be understood. I choose to understand myself. Because when you stop justifying, you'll realize something strange. The person who's judged you the most has never been anyone else. It's been you. You've built an invisible courtroom in your mind where every word and action of yours stands trial. And only when you dare to dissolve that courtroom will you truly be free. Chapter 2. The Courtroom in Your Mind. There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep can't fix, which comes not from arguing with others, but from arguing with yourself. You lie there in silence, yet dozens of voices echo in your head. Did I say something wrong? Do they think I'm cold? I should have said it differently. No one is judging you, but in your mind you're standing before a courtroom where the verdict is always the same. I'm not good enough. I've been there. I've walked away from conversations feeling guilty, even when no one blamed me. I would replay every sentence as if I had to defend myself before an invisible judge. Once, after talking with an old friend, I said something a bit too direct. She smiled, but when I got home, my head was crowded with questions. Did I hurt her feelings? Was I too cold? That night, I held my own trial, both the defendant and the judge. Carl Jung once said, "People are not hurt by reality itself, but by the way they talk to themselves about it." I realized the real courtroom isn't out there. It's inside, where I keep convicting myself for not being perfect or loved the way I hoped. The Stoics called this the rebellion of the mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The strong man is not the one who conquers others, but the one who no longer has to fight himself." When your mind becomes a battlefield, no one wins. Because no matter how many times you defend yourself, you're still the one holding the gavel. During those years, I thought I was being responsible, afraid to hurt others or be misunderstood. But in truth, I was addicted to judgment. I needed guilt to feel worthy of forgiveness. I needed to be wrong to feel redeemable. It was a subtle form of self-punishment disguised as kindness. One day I tried something different. When the voice in my head began accusing me, "You shouldn't have said that," I didn't argue. I just breathed, stayed silent, didn't resist. And strangely, in that silence, the trial stopped. Not because I won, but because I stopped playing the defendant. I realized that accusations only exist if you try to prove your innocence. From then on, I learned to stand outside my mind to watch it perform like a familiar play. When it began another trial, I smiled. The same old courtroom again, and I returned to the present where life truly happens. If you ever find yourself trapped in those inner arguments, pause right now and write a small declaration, not to prove anything but to free yourself. Today, I release the need to defend myself. Feel the lightness that follows that sentence. You don't need anyone's approval. You don't need another explanation. You need your own agreement. That's the moment you stop being the defendant in your mind and start becoming the observer, the master of your soul. And as you begin to live in that quiet awareness, you'll notice something remarkable. Your energy changes. You no longer feel drained after every conversation. You no longer need to perform to be loved or smile to keep the peace. But if you still feel tired, empty, or your energy keeps leaking away every day, perhaps those inner trials are still quietly consuming you. The next chapter will investigate that, because your exhaustion isn't just emotional. It's the result of invisible energy leaks, the places where every time you try to prove, apologize, or please someone, a part of your life force slips away. And the moment you learn to close those leaks, you'll begin to meet yourself again. Chapter 3. The energy leaks. Have you ever felt exhausted, even when you've done nothing heavy? Your body feels fine, yet something inside feels empty. You sleep enough, eat enough, but still wake up as if you've just survived a storm. I lived that way for years, days when a single unanswered message, a cold glance, or a careless word could drain my energy. I wasn't tired from work. I was exhausted from being emptied by things no one could see. Carl Jung once said, "What you do not make conscious will manifest as fate." I realized that the hidden leaks that weakened me were the most minor reactions: over-explaining, apologizing when I'd done nothing wrong, pretending to be fine when I wasn't. The Stoics called this the loss of inner force, when your mind no longer rests within you but hangs on others. Seneca once wrote, "No one grows tired of the present. We grow weary because we regret the past or fear the future. But the truth is, we also grow tired of living in the eyes of others, from constantly trying to manage how they feel about us." One morning I looked in the mirror and saw my eyes empty, not from lack of sleep, but from lack of honesty with myself. I had spent all my energy trying to be understood, accepted, and loved. I didn't know how to be silent without guilt, say no without fear, or be myself without explanation. When I started writing down the moments that made me tired, I found they weren't big things. Meeting people I didn't want to see, texting too long, and forcing a smile to keep the peace. Each time I gave away a little more of my energy. In psychology, this is called emotional leakage. In Stoic philosophy, it is mental scattering. The mind is split into too many directions. When your energy no longer belongs to you, it gets absorbed by everything you try to control but cannot. The more you want to be understood, the weaker you become. The more you fear being misunderstood, the more you lose your presence. A friend once told me, "Every conversation leaves me drained." I asked why, and she said, because I never say what I really feel. Hearing that I understood, you can't feel full of life if you keep living away from yourself. You can't be happy if you're begging others to understand you. You can't be at peace if you continually prove to be good. I began to change. Instead of explaining, I breathed. Instead of saying, I didn't mean that, I said, I understand you. Instead of trying to be understood, I chose to be present. And strangely, energy began to return. Whenever I held back an explanation, I kept a piece of my strength. I reopened a flow whenever I said no to what didn't feel right. Every time I stopped trying to please, I reclaimed freedom. If you're hearing this, pause and whisper in your mind, I protect my energy by protecting my peace. Because energy doesn't come from what you gain, but from what you stop losing. Each time you resist the urge to explain, you preserve your strength. Each time you stay silent instead of justifying, you reinforce your foundation. And gradually, you realize what drained you was never other people, but the inner battles you kept fighting alone. But soon you'll also notice something else. When peace returns, you must learn how to protect it. Because the world won't stop just because you've become calm, people will always pull you out of that stillness through requests, expectations, or subtle emotional ties. And if you have no boundaries, the peace you've found will again leak into the hands of others. That is why the next chapter speaks about the art of boundaries. Not to create distance, but to create honesty. Not to close yourself off, but to remain yourself amid the demands of the world. Chapter 4. The Moment of Silence. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, but from constantly having to explain why you're quiet, why you've changed, why you're no longer the same. I once carried that fear, afraid people would think I'd grown cold, fear of being misunderstood and fear of being left out just because I no longer spoke as much as before. But when I reached the edge of my exhaustion, I realized this silence is not an escape, but a return. Silence is not emptiness. It is where energy is reborn. When you sit still in a quiet room with no messages or attempts to explain, you begin to notice the sounds within. At first, it's chaotic. Thoughts, worries, memories. But as your breath slows, they start to fade like foam dissolving on a still lake, revealing calm, clear, and deep water. There you see yourself with no performance, no strain, just who you really are. One morning, after a night of unanswered messages, I decided not to turn on my phone. I made a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and listened to the city waking up without joining it. No posts, no replies, no need to prove I was okay. For the first time in months, my heart felt still in the most peaceful way. I realized peace doesn't come when the world is quiet, it comes when you no longer need to speak to it. Epictetus once said, "Not everything requires a reaction. Sometimes silence is the response of wisdom." Stoicism taught me that stillness is not weakness. It is the power of the conscious act of withdrawing your energy from what doesn't deserve it. When you stop speaking, you begin to hear. When you stop explaining, you begin to understand. And when you are calm enough to sit in silence, you realize that what's frightening isn't emptiness, it's that you've never truly been with yourself. If you hear this, pause and write a straightforward sentence in the comments. I find strength in silence. Let that be a promise to yourself that from today, you no longer need words to prove your worth. You only need stillness to remember who you are. But once you find peace in silence, a new challenge will appear. The world will try to pull you back through requests, expectations, and guilt. And in that moment, you'll need to learn a deeper skill to hold your boundaries. Because peace is not just found, it must be protected. In the next chapter, The Sacredness of Boundaries, we'll explore the art of protecting your energy, not by building walls, but by respecting yourself in every choice you make. Chapter 5, The Sacredness of Boundaries. Some people drain you not because they're bad, but because you don't know where to stop. You say yes when your heart wants to say no. You smile to keep the peace while your chest tightens each time. Instead of telling the truth, you make excuses to leave. I need time. I used to live that way, with a schedule filled with meetings I didn't look forward to and messages I replied to out of politeness, not sincerity. And every time I gave in, I felt myself shrink, dissolving slowly into the expectations of others. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If you want to be respected, begin by respecting yourself." I didn't understand that until I realized sometimes people don't step over you, you open the door and let them in. Boundaries aren't walls, they're doors that know when to close. When I learned to say no, I wasn't rejecting others, but choosing myself again. I saw that no one truly respects you if you allow them to hurt you. Once an old friend asked for help while I was utterly exhausted. I still said yes, telling myself just this time. But that one time became many. One day I looked in the mirror and realized I was blaming others for something I had allowed. I sent a message for the first time. "I'm sorry, I can't this time." No explanations, no justification. Just one short sentence, but it felt lighter than any apology I'd ever given. That was the first time I realized boundaries didn't make me lonely, they made me real. Stoicism teaches that no one can take your peace without handing it over. Boundaries are the art of protecting that peace. When you can say no without guilt, you are growing. When you stop explaining why you need space, you leave the cage of approval. I once thought I needed to be understood, but I needed to understand myself. If you're hearing this, take a moment and write in the comments, "My boundaries are my peace." It's not just a phrase, it's a promise to yourself. From today on, you will no longer ask for permission to rest. You will no longer need to explain to be respected. You will no longer love others more than yourself. Write it as a small milestone in your journey towards self-respect. And when you've learned to set boundaries with the world, there's a quieter battle waiting for the boundary with your mind. You may stop explaining to others, but if inside you still justify, criticize, and replay the same painful story, you're not truly free. In the next chapter, when you stop explaining to yourself, we'll enter that still place where there's no one left to convince, only yourself to accept. Sometimes peace doesn't come from being understood, it comes from finally stopping the need to explain yourself. Chapter 6. When you stop explaining to yourself. One day I realized I had stopped justifying myself to the world, but was still explaining things inside my mind. I no longer said I'm busy or fine to others, yet I still whispered to myself, I was right. I had a reason, I'm not weak. That was when I understood that sometimes others no longer judge us but by the sword of our own mind. Our mind is a courtroom that never closes. Every choice, every mistake, every silence is called to the stand. You should have spoken more clearly. You shouldn't have walked away like that. That small inner voice, which sounds like conscience, is often just an old fear kept alive by the habit of self-judgment. I used to sit up at night replaying conversations, thinking about what I should or shouldn't have said. But in the morning, looking into the mirror, I saw only this truth. I wasn't tired because of others, I was exhausted because of myself. Epictetus once said, "No man is disturbed by things but by the view he takes of them." And indeed, we don't always need someone to question us, because we've already become both the prosecutor and the accused. But everything changes once you realize you have the right to stop putting yourself on trial. You start forgiving the older versions of you. The ones who reacted were weak, trusted the wrong person, and missed the chance. You stop asking, "Why wasn't I better?" and begin saying, "Now I understand." I kept journals to analyze everything as if enough understanding would finally calm me. But the more I wrote, the more I saw that I was using reason to erase emotion instead of letting emotion be fully felt. One day, I sat down and wrote, without analyzing, just this: "Today I am sad, and that is enough." For the first time, I didn't need to understand, fix, or justify. I stayed with myself for no reason, no condition. And in that moment, peace appeared not as a reward, but as something that had always been there waiting for me to stop resisting. Stopping the need to explain to yourself doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means you learn to trust your feelings without having to defend them. It's when you stop asking, "Am I allowed to feel this way?" and start admitting, "This is how I think, and that's completely okay." When you accept, you don't become weaker, you become whole. You no longer choose between reason and emotion, between right and wrong. You desire the truth that you are human, and humans sometimes just need to rest. If you're hearing this, write in the comments, "I forgive myself for explaining too much." Let that be your release. Each time you write it, you remove one invisible chain, the chain of perfection, expectation, and fear of not being enough. Because the truth is, you never needed to be perfect to deserve peace. When you stop explaining to yourself, you no longer live in the past nor chase the future. You live honestly, fully, and present. And that's when you understand what Marcus Aurelius once wrote: "Peace comes when you stop telling yourself stories about what happened." Now we close this journey, the journey of one who once spoke too much, tried too hard, judged too deeply, and all that remains is silence, not because everything has ended, but because you finally return to yourself, where nothing needs to be proven anymore. The final silence. When you've walked through this entire journey, from stopping the need to be understood, learning silence, setting boundaries, and finally no longer explaining yourself, you'll discover something profound. Peace was never a reward. It has always been your nature, revealed only when you stop trying to be someone else. I once believed peace would come when people finally understood me, when everything was clarified, when someone admitted I was right. But Stoicism taught me that true peace begins when you no longer need any of that. When you stop seeking to be understood, you begin to understand yourself. When you stop trying to please others, you feel content simply being present. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "No one can disturb your peace unless you allow them." And that is what stillness teaches. That strength is not found in words, but in the space between them, because some truths are felt only when nothing is said. I don't know where you are in your journey. Maybe you are still trying to understand someone, or hoping someone will understand you. But if you pause, breathe deeply, and whisper to yourself today for just a few quiet moments, "I choose calm over approval," then you've already stepped into the most beautiful part of this journey, where you no longer run, no longer prove, but explain. If you've realized something, share it in the comments. What have you learned from stopping the need to explain to the world and yourself? I'll read every story, because each reflection is a mirror, reminding someone out there that they are not alone on their way back to silence. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. If these words have reached you, subscribe to Sovereign Stoic and continue with me on future Stoic paths, where we learn to live slower, deeper, and more accurately each day. Because sometimes it's not about speaking more to be understood, but staying silent long enough to finally hear yourself.